worked nights on an ambulance for almost 11 years. I'm out now. Not retired, not promoted, not anything clean like that. I quit, took a job moving medical equipment between clinics, and I still wake up thinking my radio is going off. People think the hard part of the job is blood. They think it's seeing a face opened up in a windshield, or a kid blue from not breathing. That stuff gets to you, but not in the way people think. Most of the time, you don't have room to feel much in the moment. You're busy. You're trying to solve a problem with your hands while somebody screams in your ear. The bad part comes later, when you remember one little detail you didn't need to notice. A sticker on a fridge. Mud on a child's sock. The sound a husband makes when he understands his wife is dead, and there is nothing in the world he can trade for one more minute with her. You carry those things home. They build up in layers. After a while, whole sections of the city start to feel heavy for no reason that would make sense to anybody else. For me, it was one neighborhood on the east side. It wasn't a bad area in the usual way. It wasn't the place we went for gang shootings or overdoses or people getting drunk and trying to fight their cousins at family parties. It was older, mostly working people. Brick houses with small porches, narrow yards, trees that had gotten too big for the streets decades ago. Some houses were kept up, some were halfway to falling down, but it wasn't chaos. It was just old, and for years we kept getting sent there. At first it didn't mean anything. You work long enough, you start seeing patterns everywhere. Certain apartment buildings call for asthma constantly because they're full of mold. Certain bars give you stabbings. Certain intersections give you motorcycles sliding under trucks all summer. My partner for most of that period, Leon, used to say every block in the city had its own personality. Maybe he was right. This patch was only a handful of streets, a rectangle maybe 6 or 7 blocks across. Maple Court, Bream Street, Holloway, Fitch, and 2 short side roads that dead-ended at a drainage ditch behind an abandoned machine shop. The houses sat close together there. Front doors opened right onto the sidewalk in some spots. The streetlights were old and weak, and in bad weather the whole area looked brown and yellow, like nicotine stains. We caught everything there, but not all at once. That's what hit it. An elderly man who fell in his basement and split his head open on a furnace. A woman found at the bottom of her back steps with a broken neck. A house fire with 1 fatality. A child almost drowned in a bathtub. A middle-aged guy who supposedly slipped while trimming branches and came down on his side so hard his spleen ruptured. Domestic assaults, cardiac arrests, suicides. If you lined up every call we ran in the city, that neighborhood probably wouldn't even stand out statistically. But when you actually worked it, when you were the one getting dragged into the same quiet streets over and over in every kind of weather, it started to feel wrong. Not cursed. I'm not saying anything stupid like that. I just mean wrong in the human sense. Like there was a hand on the scale somewhere. The first time I saw him, I didn't remember him at all. That came later, when I started going back through reports and body camera clips from police and trying to piece together how long he'd been near us. His name was Martin Gable. If you live the kind of life where you know your neighbors, you've known a man like him. Mid-50s maybe older. Hard to tell because he had one of those faces that looked good from a distance and worn up close. Neat gray hair, clean jackets, always dressed like he had somewhere modest but respectable to be. church volunteer look, car wash fundraiser look, the kind of man who carries folding chairs without being asked and remembers your dog's name. That's if you saw him in daylight. At night, under porch bulbs and ambulance strobes, he always looked a little too calm. Not emotionless. That would have stood out. He knew how to look upset. He knew how to frown, how to shake his head, how to put a hand on someone's shoulder. But his calm sat under all that, like concrete under grass. I noticed him first the way you notice recurring furniture. He was simply there too often. A woman stabbed in her kitchen by an intruder who turned out not to exist. Martin was outside in house shoes, holding a blanket around her teenage daughter while police went room to room. He told us he heard the girl screaming and ran over. A man beaten so badly in his garage that both eye sockets were fractured. Martin was the one guiding us through the side gate saying, "Careful, there's oil on the ground." A young mother found unconscious in her bathroom after what looked like a fall. Martin stood on the porch with her little boy on his hip, telling him everything was going to be okay in the same tone you'd use to explain that the library was closed. A fire in a duplex that killed one tenant from smoke inhalation and burned the other badly enough that skin came away with the blanket when we moved him. Martin had already gotten 2 people out and was coughing theatrically into his sleeve when the engine company arrived. It didn't register at first because there are people like that in every city. Helpers, busybodies, men and women who appear any time a siren stops near their house because they want to help, or at least stand close enough to feel involved. We depended on them sometimes. Someone has to unlock a gate, point to the side entrance, tell you where the spare oxygen is, stop a dog from biting your legs while you carry a patient out. If a neighbor is competent and steady, you remember them in a good way. That was Martin for a long time. I even liked him. He knew everybody. If he didn't know your name, he knew your mother's name, or where you worked, or that your boy had moved back in after his divorce. He was always carrying groceries for somebody, raking leaves for some widow, checking in on old men who lived alone. He went to wakes. He fixed porch railings. He brought casseroles. He was the kind of person newspapers love to quote after a tragedy, because he could say the right thing without sounding rehearsed. Only he did sound rehearsed. Once I knew to listen. Not at first. At first I just thought he was composed. The neighborhood itself got under my skin before he did. There was one call that started it. A girl, 13 or 14 maybe. We got dispatched for an unconscious juvenile. It was warm out, and the street was full of people standing barefoot on porches, all of them pointed at one house. The girl was in an upstairs bedroom. Her mother found her on the floor beside the bed. The mother kept saying, "Seizure, seizure." My daughter has never had a seizure. The girl was alive when we got there, but barely. Bruising around the throat. Tiny burst vessels in the eyes. The kind of thing you notice even when everyone else in the room is shouting about epilepsy or drugs or asthma or anything but what is plainly in front of them. I asked the mother if anyone else had been in the house. She said no. Then she said Martin had come in when she started screaming. He was in the hall when I came out with the stretcher, pressed flat to the wallpaper to give us room, eyes wide, hands clasped like he was praying. He asked if the girl was breathing. I said yes. He nodded, looked sick, and stepped back. She died 2 days later. Police charged the mother's ex-boyfriend, and then dropped it. He had an alibi. Last I heard, the case was still open. Maybe it always will be. I forgot Martin again after that. That's the truth. I wish I had not, but I did. We were busy, and people die, and every shift brings the next disaster. What made the neighborhood different was that nobody seemed to die clean there. I don't mean peacefully. I mean the story was never straight. Somebody falls, but the angle of the injuries is odd. Somebody gets attacked, but there are no signs of forced entry. Somebody overdoses even though family swears they never used. A husband kills himself in the shed, but the wife insists he was scared of guns. Cops shrug, write things down, move on. They have 1,000 cases. We had 1,000 calls. Life keeps shoving you forward. Then came Mrs. Weller. That one stayed with me because I held her hand while she drowned in her own blood. She was 76, lived alone on Fitch in a house full of doilies and heavy dark furniture. Her neighbor called because the front door was open and Mrs. Weller was lying in the dining room. The caller was Martin. When we got inside, there was blood everywhere, but not in the way movies do it. Not sprayed artfully over walls. Real blood. Thick, blackish in the dim light, soaked into the tablecloth, pooled under the chair legs, tracked by one shoe across the linoleum. She had cuts on both forearms like she'd tried to shield herself. And there was one deep wound under the jaw that had opened her from chin to throat. I remember the sound more than the sight. Wet air trying to move through a ruined neck. We worked her because you work everybody until you can't. Leon packed the wound while I suctioned and tried to keep her airway from filling. She looked right at me. That's what I still get sometimes in my sleep. Her eyes were clear. She knew exactly what was happening. We did not save her. Martin stood outside in the yard with blood on his cuff. He told police he found her after noticing the door open when he was bringing in her trash can. He said he touched her neck to see if she had a pulse. Reasonable. Everything about him was always reasonable. I smoked half a cigarette after that call and threw the rest away because it tasted like the room smelled. Leon said, "This neighborhood again." I said, "Yeah." That was the first time I heard myself say it out loud. Something is wrong over here. Leon didn't laugh. He didn't agree either. He just rubbed his face and said, "Old houses, old people, too many secrets." Maybe that should have been the answer. The thing about obsession is it usually starts as bookkeeping. I began checking addresses after calls, mostly out of curiosity. End of shift, tired, eating vending machine crackers at the station while the fluorescent lights hummed. I'd look through the run list and count how many were from those few streets. More than felt normal. Enough that I started pointing them out to dispatchers when they printed end-of-month summaries. Nobody cared. Why would they? A neighborhood with a lot of old residents and neglected houses generates emergencies. That's city life. Still, I kept noticing Martin. A collapsed porch on Holloway. He was there with a flashlight before the fire department. A teen found wandering in traffic with a concussion and blood on the back of his head. Martin had him wrapped in a coat. An overdose in a detached garage. Martin was the one doing chest compressions when we arrived. Elbows locked. Count perfectly steady. Once he even helped me carry a patient because the guy weighed close to 300 pounds and Leon had wrenched his back the shift before. Martin was stronger than he looked. He didn't grunt, didn't complain, just got under the dead weight with us and moved. Afterward, he stood in the driveway breathing lightly while I sweated through my uniform shirt. He said, "Glad I could help." I thanked him. I shook his hand more than once. That matters to me now in a way I can't explain without sounding dramatic. But there is something terrible about learning you were polite to a man with blood under his nails while trying to save the person he put there. Years passed like that. Not every shift, not every week, just enough. People moved in and out. Houses got sold. One burned down and sat as a black shell for months. Martin remained. He seemed to belong to the neighborhood more than anybody. Even when he wasn't at the exact address, people brought him up. Martin checked on me after my surgery. Martin shoveled my walk. Martin came by when Tommy died. Martin has a key in case anything happens. That last part should have landed harder than it did. A lot of people had given him keys. I know that because I learned it later from interviews, from statements, from one old woman crying into a tissue and saying she thought he was safe because everybody trusted him. The turning point for me was not one of the murders. It was a dog. We got called for an animal attack. Usually that means somebody's been bitten and the animal has run off or is still chewing on them. This was a pit bull in a fenced yard, going crazy over something in the flower bed behind a garage. The homeowner had cuts on his hands from trying to pull it back. When officers dug in the dirt where the dog kept lunging, they found a trash bag. Inside was a cat, cut open. Not hit by a car, not torn by another animal, deliberately opened. The homeowner was pale and shaking, insisting he didn't own a cat and had no idea where it came from. His little girl was hysterical because she thought the bag might have been a baby. While we treated the cuts on the father's hands, I looked through the fence slats and saw Martin standing in the alley behind the yard, not trying to come in, just watching. When he saw me notice him, he lifted one hand in a small wave and walked on. That stuck with me because it was the first time he looked wrong before I had a reason ready for it. A few weeks later, a teenage boy on Maple Court was found dead in his bedroom. Blunt force trauma. The story from family was that he'd had friends over. There was drinking. Maybe somebody hit him and panicked. But the room didn't look like a fight. It looked arranged. Drawers open, window lifted, desk chair overturned. Not one thing where it would have landed naturally. Somebody had made a mess for other people to read. Martin was on the porch with the boy's grandmother, holding both her hands, speaking softly into her face while she stared past him in shock. I looked at him for too long. He turned, caught me staring, and gave me the smallest nod, like we were co-workers meeting again under difficult circumstances. That bothered me all shift. Leon asked what was wrong with me while we wiped down the bench seat in the back. I said, "Do you ever think that guy is around too much?" "Which guy?" "The neighbor. Martin. Gray hair. Always first on scene." Leon shrugged. "Some people are like that. He's at everything." Leon snapped the biohazard bag shut and said, "So are we." That should have embarrassed me. It almost did. But once the thought took shape, it kept growing. I started asking quietly. Cops, firefighters, a couple of dispatchers who had been on the job long enough to remember names. Most shrugged. One patrol sergeant said, "Helpful fella. Wish I had 10 of him." Another officer said, "He found that Weller lady, didn't he? I said yes. Officer said, "Better him than nobody." That was the wall you hit every time. Better him than nobody. If a man is always at emergencies because he causes them, the exact same behavior also looks like compassion. He calls 911. He unlocks the door. He comforts the grieving. He directs responders to the right room. In a city where half the problem is people refusing to get involved, he looked like the answer. I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I started pulling old incident reports when I had downtime. Nothing confidential enough to get me arrested, but enough that if my supervisors knew how much time I spent on it, they would have told me to mind my own job. I made a list of serious calls from those streets over several years. Fatal fires, assaults, suspicious falls, unexplained arrests that later turned into deaths. Then I wrote down whether Martin's name appeared in the narrative as caller, witness, neighbor, bystander, family friend, key holder, anything. His name was attached to too many of them. Not most. That's what made it hard. Maybe a third. Maybe a little more if you stretched and included times he was mentioned by another witness, but not interviewed directly. A third is not proof. In a close neighborhood, one socially active man can touch a third of local tragedies by chance. That's what I told myself while I kept going. Then I found the Richards fire. That one had happened before I transferred to nights, but I remembered hearing about it. Mother dead, son badly burned, official cause faulty space heater. In the fire report, there was a note from an investigator. Neighbor Martin Gable attempted rescue, suffered minor smoke inhalation. In the police supplement, there was a statement from the surviving son, taken at the hospital before heavy sedation. He said he woke up to shouting outside his room. He thought he smelled gasoline before the smoke. The note had been disregarded because the room contained fuel for lawn equipment stored improperly in a back utility space. Possible source. Case closed. I read that line 3 times. Then I looked up later addresses connected to the son after he moved back into the neighborhood with relatives. 3 years later, we had transported him after an overdose in a garage on Holloway. Martin had been performing chest compressions when we arrived. At that point, I still didn't think what you're thinking. I didn't think serial killer, mastermind, monster. Real life pushes against those words. They belong to documentaries and old newspaper clippings with bad mugshots. I thought something smaller, and maybe more likely. Maybe Martin liked being in the middle of tragedy too much. Maybe he tampered with scenes after the fact. Maybe he inserted himself into investigations. Maybe he hurt vulnerable people in ways that would never rise to murder. I had no shape for it yet. Then I met his wife. Her name was Denise. I'd never seen her before because, as I learned, she had been in a nursing facility recovering from a stroke for months. We were called to Martin's house for difficulty breathing not long after she came home. She was thin in the way people get when illness takes both appetite and pride. Not skeletal, just reduced. Her left arm was contracted against her chest. Speech slurred. Bed set up in the front room because she couldn't manage stairs. Martin met us at the door, frantic in all the right ways. Said she had choked while eating, then started gasping. He had suction equipment from the facility and had tried to clear her airway. We found Denise with low oxygen but stable enough to move after treatment. What I remember is the bruise on the inside of her upper arm. Finger marks, old enough to yellow at the edges. I asked Martin about it. He didn't blink. Said she bruised easily during transfers. Could be true. When I leaned down near Denise to adjust the mask, she looked at me with a ferocity I had not seen in many stroke patients. People assume weakness reads as softness. It doesn't. Sometimes a person who can barely move looks at you like a trapped animal. She said something I couldn't understand. I asked her to repeat it. It came out wet and tangled. Martin stepped in smoothly and said, "She gets anxious, thinks she's falling when we move her." Denise made a noise then, not a word. A furious noise. I looked at Martin, then back at her, and for the first time I felt something close to fear around him. Nothing happened from that call. We transported her. Hospital treated aspiration, maybe pneumonia starting. Sent her to rehab again. On paper it was routine, but I could not let go of her face. A few months later, Denise died. Natural causes as far as everyone knew. Complications after another infection. I only learned about it because an ER nurse mentioned Martin seemed heartbroken when he came to collect her belongings. Not long after that, the calls in the neighborhood got worse. Not more frequent. Worse. A little boy beaten nearly to death while babysat by his mother's boyfriend, except the boyfriend's timeline didn't hold. An old man smothered during a burglary where nothing valuable was taken. A woman attacked from behind in her own kitchen, skull fractured with a cast iron pan, then dragged halfway to the back door for reasons nobody could explain. A young man on Bream Street found in his bathtub with his wrist cut so deeply, one hand was almost detached. Police called it suicide for a week, until the angle and depth made no sense. Martin was attached to all of them in one way or another. Witness, caller, comforter. Last known visitor in one case, though that fact got buried because visiting an elderly neighbor is not a crime. I started losing sleep over it. Not because I was certain, because I wasn't. Certainty would have let me act. Instead, I had a pile of ugly coincidences and a sense in my gut that kept getting louder. I told one detective I knew moderately well, a woman named Carver, who had worked domestic violence before homicide. I bought her coffee from the machine at County and laid it out as carefully as I could, trying not to sound like an exhausted ambulance driver with a neighborhood fixation. She listened. She didn't mock me. Then she said, "Even if you're right, what do you have?" I said, "He's always there." She said, "So are church ladies and nosy retirees." I said, "It's more than that." She asked for specifics. I gave her what I had. Denise's bruises, the repeated proximity, the key holder issue, the strange mix of accidents and assaults. Carver rubbed one eyebrow with her thumb and said, "I can look at him, but proximity isn't enough. If he's as involved as you say, he's either a saint or careful." That word stayed with me. Careful. She did look at him, I think. At least a little. Nothing came of it. If she ran his history, it would have shown almost nothing. No violent priors, no obvious complaints. He'd worked maintenance for the school district, then retired early. Volunteer work, wife ill, ordinary life. And then he killed the Van family. I call it that because that is what it was, though officially the father got most of the blame and then died before trial. We were sent for a domestic disturbance with injuries. Small house on Maple Court. Front window broken. Neighbors outside in coats, not speaking. We went in with police. The mother was in the kitchen with trauma to the head so severe I thought she was already gone. The father was in the hallway trying to crawl, one leg twisted under him wrong. 2 children upstairs, girl dead in bed, boy alive under a desk with blood running from both ears. There was a baseball bat in the bathroom. The father kept saying, "Not me, not me." Somebody came in, but his hands were covered in blood, and a lot of men say a lot of things when their world has caved in around them. I helped package the boy while officers dragged the father outside. On the porch, Martin had his arms around a neighbor who was sobbing into his chest. He looked at the father with exactly the right amount of disgust. The father died at the hospital from internal bleeding. The mother died in surgery. The little boy lived with permanent deficits. The girl was buried the next week. Case looked simple for about 10 days. Father snapped, killed family, maybe an interrupted murder-suicide, or maybe someone else injured him during the chaos. Then forensic issues started piling up. Wrong blood transfer on the bat. Broken latch on a side window that had older damage under fresh splintering. Shoe impressions in the flower bed inconsistent with the father's shoes. But by then the public version had already set like plaster. Martin was everywhere after that, organizing meal trains, standing with relatives, speaking to a local reporter about how the neighborhood had to come together after unimaginable violence. I watched him on television in the EMS lounge while eating a stale sandwich and felt my skin crawl. He said, "We all have to look out for one another now more than ever." I got physically sick in the station bathroom after that. Not because of what he said, because I still had no proof, and he sounded sincere enough that part of me wondered if I had lost my mind. The proof came by accident, and too late to save anyone it would have mattered to save. It was Denise again, in a way. Her niece came through the emergency department with a panic attack after an argument with her brother over probate. I only know this because Leon heard a nurse talking and told me, half joking, "Your boyfriend from Maple Court has family drama." Normally that would have been nothing. But I asked around and learned the niece believed some of Denise's jewelry and personal papers had gone missing before Denise died. People steal from dying relatives all the time. It wasn't the jewelry that got me. It was the papers. I used a favor I had no right to use and got the niece's number from somebody who shouldn't have given it to me. I called off duty and told her who I was. To my surprise, she met me at a diner. She was tense, embarrassed, angry. Said Denise had been keeping notes after the stroke because her speech was bad, and she wanted to communicate when Martin pretended not to understand her. Not a diary exactly. More a stack of notepads she kept near the bed. After Denise died, they were gone. I asked what kind of notes. The niece said, complaints. Names. Things she said she wanted to tell people. I said what things? She looked at me for a while, and then said Denise had accused Martin of hurting people. Not killing them. Not directly. She thought he went into homes when people were asleep or medicated or too old to fight back. Took things, moved things, scared them, squeezed bruises into them. Made them feel crazy. The family thought Denise was confused from the stroke. Then the niece said one more thing. Denise had written down a name over and over. Weller. Mrs. Weller, the old woman who bled out in her dining room. I asked why. The niece said Denise claimed Martin had come home that night with blood on his sleeve before police were ever at the house. When Denise confronted him, he told her she was mistaken. and later moved her to the nursing facility faster than the family expected. That was enough for me. Not enough legally, maybe. Enough personally. I took it to Carver. This time she leaned forward. That got things moving. Quietly at first. Reopened interviews, search warrant angles, financials, property access, old injury photos. They found Martin had been listed as emergency contact, key holder, or home access helper for more residents than anyone realized. They found small thefts that never amounted to much because grieving families assumed the items were misplaced. They found he had inserted himself into cleanups and post-incident repairs, giving himself access after crimes as well as before. Still no direct line to murder. Then a patrol officer remembered something from years back and actually wrote it down this time. A welfare check on an old man on Holloway. Martin had answered the door claiming the man was asleep and didn't want to be disturbed. Officer left. The old man was found dead the next morning. Natural enough death that nobody thought twice. Carver got the body exhumed because of tissue questions from the original report. There was evidence of suffocation. After that, the dam broke. Not publicly. In files, in interviews, in the private sick feeling of people realizing a shape exists underneath a mess of unrelated pain. Enough old cases were re-examined that Martin became the center of a task force. They watched him, followed him, searched his trash, pulled phone records, talked to anyone still alive who had once trusted him with a key. And while they built their case, he kept moving. That's the part I have the hardest time living with. Once police finally took him seriously, I thought it was over. I thought careful people get sloppy when attention turns on them. Maybe he did. Maybe it just wasn't fast enough. During those weeks, a woman on Fitch had her throat cut so deeply in her kitchen that responding officers initially thought her head was nearly severed. Her adult son came home during it and was beaten with a hammer on the back step. He survived after 3 surgeries. A man in a duplex off Bream died in a fire started in his recliner. Accelerant pattern. Deliberate. An elderly widow on Holloway disappeared for 2 days and was found in the drainage ditch behind the machine shop, wrapped in a rug from her own living room. Cause of death was blunt force trauma, followed by drowning, which is a sentence I still hate to say because of how much it contains. Martin attended the vigil for her. I saw him there because I went too, standing at the edge in uniform after shift. Candles in paper cups. Neighbors crying. Reporters keeping a decent distance for once. Martin was comforting a teenage girl whose grandmother had known the dead woman. He had one arm around her, his face folded in sympathy. He looked up and saw me. This time he didn't nod. He smiled. Not big. Not a grin. Just enough to tell me he knew. It was the first openly wrong thing I ever saw him do. I told Carver immediately. She said it was nothing admissible but asked exactly how he smiled, which sounds stupid until you've done enough witness interviews to know small human details matter. 2 nights later, they arrested him. Not for murder at first. Burglary, evidence tampering, assault connected to a surviving victim who finally remembered enough through fear and pain medication to say Martin had been in her bedroom before she was injured. Once they had him in custody, warrants turned into searches. Searches turned into boxes. They found keys. So many keys, labeled and unlabeled. Old-fashioned house keys, newer copies, little tags from hardware stores, coded stickers. They found jewelry that belonged to dead women, and at least one watch traced to the Van father. They found condolence cards he had kept from funerals of people now believed to be his victims. The worst thing they found was notebooks. Not trophies in the movie sense, not dramatic confessions. Plain pocket notebooks with dates, addresses, observations, backdoor sticks in humidity, dog put down, husband on second shift, daughter away at college, Weller asleep by 9 after pain pills, Denise watching, need to move papers. He wrote like a maintenance man making repair notes. That was what finally broke me. I had imagined that if there was proof, it would look monstrous, something wild and obvious and easy to hate. But it was small handwriting in cheap paper, practical and tidy. The evil of it was how ordinary it looked. They never proved every death. Maybe they never will. But enough of it stuck. He had a pattern, though not the kind television likes. He wasn't hunting strangers in parks. He was cultivating dependency, becoming useful, getting into the routines of fragile people and troubled families, learning who was medicated, who drank, whose doors didn't latch, who would be blamed if something violent happened in the house. Sometimes he stole. Sometimes he seemed to enjoy frightening people first. Sometimes he escalated to beatings or cuts or fire. There were signs he liked to be present for the discovery or immediate aftermath. That part everyone had already seen and mistaken for decency. Carver once said she thought the helping was half the point, not covering his tracks, not excitement after the fact, possession. He wanted the grief too. He wanted to stand in the center of the damage and be thanked for his kindness. I believe that what I don't know, and never will, is why some people he merely tormented, while others he butchered. Yes, butchered. That is the right word for at least 3 of them. Mrs. Weller's throat. The woman on Fitch almost decapitated in her kitchen. The cuts on the man in the bathtub, deep enough that the bathroom looked like an abattoir by the time police forced the door. He could be methodical for years, and then suddenly vicious beyond reason. Or maybe there was a reason only he knew. Maybe he punished disrespect. Maybe he got bored. Maybe someone saw too much. He did eventually confess to parts of it, from what Carver told me, but not in a useful way. He lied, minimized, blended cases together, blamed some on mercy, some on panic, some on victims themselves. He said Denise had been ungrateful. He said Mrs. Weller was already dying. He said the Van father was a violent drunk and would have ruined his family anyway. Every statement turned him into either rescuer or corrector, never the author of suffering. I was asked to testify for one hearing about repeated scene contact. Not much. Just enough to establish how often I had encountered him at emergencies over the years. He sat there in county khakis, listening with the same calm I remembered from porches and sidewalks. Older, smaller somehow, but not ashamed. He looked bored until I mentioned shaking his hand. Then he looked at me directly, and for a second I saw something close to pleasure. That is the face I carry now. People like endings where the villain gets exposed and the world makes sense again. That is not what happened. He was charged in several deaths and attacks. A few cases were strong, a few weaker. Families got some answers. Newspapers ran long pieces about trust and neighborhoods and hidden predators. Comment sections filled with people saying they always knew something was off, which is easy to say after handcuffs. But most of the dead stayed dead in the same dumb, irreversible way the dead always do. The little boy from the van house still needs supervision as an adult. The son from the woman on Fitch walks with a drag in one leg and has metal in his skull. At least one family still believes police framed Martin because they cannot bear the fact that they loved him. And me, I get to live with a different kind of knowledge. I spent years trying to save people from a city that hurt them. Car wrecks, bad hearts, overdoses, beatings, accidents, all the standard ways bodies fail and people fail each other. And mixed in with all that, over and over, was one man manufacturing misery with the same hands he used to pat backs and wrap blankets around shoulders. I let him hand me patience. I let him stand beside my stretcher. I thanked him. I accepted directions from him while somebody bled out in the next room. There are particular memories that poison others around them. Once, after a difficult code, he brought bottled water out to us from somebody's refrigerator because the family was too distraught to think about anything practical. I drank it while sweat dried on my neck. Another time he squeezed my shoulder and said, "Rough night, friend." I remember being grateful for the simple human kindness of that. When I learned what he was, those moments didn't turn unreal. That would almost be easier. They stayed exactly as they were, only contaminated. Real kindness from a man who also cut old women open and set fires and pressed pillows over faces. Real gratitude in me for help that came from the same source as the suffering. That is worse than if he had been obvious. Obvious evil lets you brace yourself. This was neighborly. This was casseroles and spare keys and folded hands at vigils. I still drive through that neighborhood sometimes, though I don't have any reason to. The city replaced some of the streetlights. A few houses were torn down. Kids ride bikes there now. New people moved in who don't know the names. The machine shop is still abandoned. The drainage ditch still floods in heavy rain. Martin's house was sold after the trial mess started. They painted it blue. There's a plastic playhouse in the yard now. I don't stop when I pass it. Once I saw a man carrying groceries into the place, ordinary as could be, and my chest went tight so hard I had to pull over. Not because I thought it was Martin, because it wasn't. Because the world keeps covering itself back up. That neighborhood looks normal. That's the insult. You can stand on Maple Court in daylight and hear lawn mowers and a dog barking behind a fence and someone arguing gently over whether the trash came yet. You would never know how much blood went into those floorboards over the years. You would never know how many times our ambulance rolled in and found Martin already there, steady and useful, his face arranged into concern while the person he hurt made their last sounds in front of him. I know. That's all I got in the end. Not peace. Not even the satisfaction of having seen it early enough. Just knowledge. Knowledge that while I was kneeling on kitchen tile trying to keep a stranger alive, sometimes the man standing close enough to hand me gauze was the reason she was dying. Knowledge that some of the worst screams I ever heard were pulled out of people by a man whose hand I shook in thanks. Knowledge that I spent years working inside a pattern I only understood once there were too many bodies to ignore. You can call that closure if you want. I don't. To me it feels like this. There was a man in our city who learned that if he hurt people carefully enough and then loved them publicly enough, he could live among the damage like a priest. And for years we let him.